going to introduce our speaker this morning. He's looking at pasture seeding, and something I always need to do and I never get done right, so he's going to help us get our pasture seeding going.
Thanks,
Go
Barry.
ahead.
All righty, well, it's good to be here with you today. You know, it's just good to be out and be with producers, and I guess I'm still recovering mentally from being shut in from all the COVID stuff. So it's good to be with you guys. And, so I'm Barton. I'm actually I work for the University of Wyoming Extension, but I'm based in Thermopolis, and I actually work anymore. It's pretty much all of Western Wyoming. Working on projects from Sheridan to Evanston. And I'm a range management person, so this is going to have a decidedly range management slant to it. So if that's not what you want to hear, I won't be offended if you leave. Maybe a little bit. But so kind of a little bit about where I work. So I've been there since 2004, always in Thermopolis. When I first started, I pretty much just worked in the Bighorn Basin, and then they added Fremont County to my area fairly quickly, and then we've had a lot of position vacancies, I guess you might say, in University of Wyoming Extension, and so I guess I've kind of morphed into working throughout Western Wyoming, and I'm enjoying it because I get to see a lot of country and work with a lot of producers. I do a lot of work with grazing issues, a lot of stuff on federal grazing permits, and then of course also private lands. So anyways, I'm glad to be here. I'd really like this to be a discussion, so if you have a question, a comment, at any time, don't wait till the end. If something comes up, just shout out or raise your hand. Any arguments, you can keep those to yourself. That'd be all right. Anyway, one of the things I work on is helping folks do some pasture reclamation, pasture seeding, and it just seemed that when I was talking with Chance Marshall about what he would like me to present here today at Farm and Ranch Days, this subject came up. And one of the reasons I think it's kind of been on our mind is the University of Wyoming Extension. We have a little tractor. There's a picture of it right here. We have a little rangeland drill, a Truex rangeland drill. It's pretty small, and we do it kind of for some experiments or for some research. The producers have used it as well. We try to kind of keep it mainly for not great big projects or for commercial operations, but for trying out new stuff. It's only got a 4-foot seeding width, so I mean it's a pretty small little deal. But we carry it around the basin a little bit, and in fact I had it clear over to Star Valley this summer working on a riparian area restoration project that was pretty cool. But it's kind of one of those things that's been coming up on our radar, and I get quite a few questions about. And then I had a couple guys that were using it on some stuff that I think were really kind of had some, they had some questions and concerns about scheduling using this. And it kind of just brought to my mind that maybe we could have some, it might be useful to have some information about some pasture seeding techniques. So that's kind of where I'm coming on this. So, on this slide, where's it going? And I kind of tried to use the picture there with the tractor on the trailer, or where's it going? But really what I want to talk about is where's the seed going? And so that's one of my first questions when someone comes to me and says, and they're asking me questions about how they should be doing some seeding, is I'm going to start asking them questions. And so that I can formulate a worthwhile answer to them. And so what I really want producers to consider, and if I'm working with you, what I'm going to need to know is where is that seed going? And of course, it's going in the South 40 pasture. Well, we need to know a lot more than that. So there's things we need to know that are going to make or break that can help make or break our pasture seeding project. So what I'm thinking about here in terms of where's it going is I want to know things like the soil type. I want to know things like your elevation. I even might want to know things like aspect, slope, things like that. And if you have the opportunity to go there and we're really thinking in terms of what am I going to plant, then I want to be able to go and look and see what's already growing there too. It's something that's going to really help me out and help you out as a producer. Yeah, Perry.
Do you do much with holistic range management?
So I would say yes, but holistic has a lot of meanings to different people, and so I would like to consider myself as a holistic range manager, but there's some nuances to that term that sometimes maybe other people would say I'm not. So, but is there a follow-up question or?
No, I mean,
Okay. All right.
I believe strongly in it if you have the right
Okay.
land.
Okay.
Sorry.
Did you believe in soil sampling before planting, or?
Yeah. So that's another. Thank you for leading me right up into that. The soil sampling is a really nice. I really like to use soil sampling in conjunction with what's already growing there, as long as it's not just bare soil. Those kind of things really help. So if you're not familiar with soil testing is really easy to do. The hardest part about soil testing is you have to write a small check, and in most cases you're going to have to mail it off. So there, University of Wyoming used to have a soils lab. When I first came here, we had a soils lab. We don't anymore. There's other options now. CSU has a lab. I use a private lab that's out of state to send most of my samples to. I try not to, as a University of Wyoming Extension employee, I try not to carry the water for a private lab. But if we want to talk more on a one-on-one or individual basis, I have some recommendations, just based on ease of use and customer service, that kind of stuff. But I really do encourage soil sampling, and depending on the area we're going to be doing and the variety of the landscape that's there, we might be doing things like taking subsamples and putting them into an aggregate sample. On very small plots, we might just be taking 1 or 2 samples and sending them in. When you send a soil sample in, you can get a lot of information that's very useful for $14-20 for the sample plus the shipping. So it's really an economical way to do it. That tells you some important things like the soil pH, which in almost all of Wyoming is going to be basic, so it's going to be above 7 usually on the pH scale. Tells you your organic matter. If we're going to be doing things like fertilizing, most of the soils labs can give you a fertilizing recommendation as well, based on the crop you want to the crop you're going to be seeding. And so that's another really helpful information thing to have. I work with people all the time too that aren't so much on the commercial ag operation side of things, but they might be in the horticulture and gardens, and that's one of the first things I talk to them about is let's get a soil sample and get your baseline. The other really useful thing about doing a soil sample is if you want to measure the progress or how your soil might change over time, if you're thinking about soil amendments or maybe doing a grazing regime that's going to help improve your soil, you can get a baseline and see if what you're doing is changing things, which can be a slow process. So really think about where that seed's going to be going and what your resources are there, what you have in terms. That's going to really help us out in terms of, we'll get to this a little bit later, but species selection. So then I want to get to seedbed preparation, and I threw that picture up there, but really there's a lot of times where we're going to be doing a whole lot less seedbed preparation than what you see there. And in terms of our little, so that drill we have on the back of that tractor, that's a no-till drill. So we wouldn't be doing this kind of seedbed preparation. But I'll tell you from some experiences that usually the more seedbed preparation you're able to do or you're willing to do, a lot of times that leads to higher success in terms of seeding success and getting those plants up out of the ground to go. And so what you're looking for, there are some distinct advantages with the no-till drill to being able to seed into stubble or being able to seed into something that's not necessarily, that doesn't look like that. But when you have a nice, even, somewhat firm seed bed, that really can improve your chances of getting the seeding to come out. So that's a real important consideration, is how much seed bed preparation you're going to do. Also competition from plants. So one of the things that I've seen cause failures, especially with the no-till drill, is if you have species that are already there on the ground that are still competing. So we're not talking about like oat stubble, but we're talking about seeding into living perennial grasses or even annual plants that are actively growing and providing competition. That's a serious risk factor when we're using the no-till drill. So the next big question I'm going to ask is, what's it for? So I work with a variety of producers that are wanting to do pasture seeding. Everyone who has a few acres that they want to put a horse on, to a 3,000 head cow operation, and then something like this situation is going to be fairly unique. So what's it for? And what I'm talking about there is really, is this something that's going to be used to stabilize the soil? Is this something that's going to be used for aesthetic purposes? Or are we sure enough going to be grazing this with livestock? And if we're going to be grazing it with livestock, what kind of livestock? And then also, is there going to be wildlife present? So those are going to be some big questions that are going to influence what we might seed and what we're going to go in there with. Any questions on that? So you can really imagine that, in this picture where I've got that sheep out there on the winter range, that could be a lot different than someone who's got 5 acres that wants to have a horse on it for a little bit.
You would plant with a no-till out there?
Well, yeah. That, right, especially with that seam of rock there, that'd be pretty rough right there. I kind of was using that as an extreme position, as an extreme example. And so I have not used that no-till drill in country that rough, but it can handle some fairly rough stuff. Yeah.
So sagebrush ground that's not that big? Or?
Not that big, right? And that's a huge amount of rock right there. There's no
Yeah,
way you
it
could
is.
plant right there.
I wasn't thinking about the rock, I was thinking
I'm
about
sorry.
the other one. So.
And it would be, this would be an example where risk of failure is going to go up because we're farther away from that. What I showed in the other picture of that.
Well, Mother Nature has to do a lot for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
How much would that sagebrush right there compete with any kind of grass you planted there?
Well, the sagebrush is going to compete with it quite a bit. And then, so you think about between the sagebrushes, you've got a lot of interspaces, and then it's not just a sagebrush, but in a spot like that, you not only have sagebrush, but you've got lots of bunch grasses that are native and non-native bunch grasses that are growing between those sagebrushes that are probably going to give you the bulk of your competition.
So something like that, would that be a candidate to spray or burn or push hog or something before you go in?
Yeah, those kind of things would usually increase your chances of success on a range seeding. Absolutely. So the next thing I want to ask for folks is season of use. And by this I mean is when are you going to be using this for, especially if it's going to be for a grazing operation, which for most of us here probably is the case, is when are we going to be interested in grazing it? So I've got that nice picture on the left of dormant season grazing. The picture on the right with one of our favorite larkspur plants in it in the summertime. And this makes a big difference. And it might be that you want, especially on those smaller acreages where we've got livestock on it maybe year round, we might be talking about all seasons. On the larger ag operations, we might be talking about a spring pasture, a summer pasture. But season of use, what I also want to get at too is not just time of year, but what else is going to be growing there during those times of year. So the reason I put this up is on the left-hand side, that's a ranch that I'm fairly familiar with, and it's pretty much, there's a forest permit that goes along with this place. And so when they're talking about season of use, I mean, they're straight up talking, this is wintertime dormant season grazing pretty much exclusively, okay? And so in that pasture, it's mostly tall wheatgrass and then a heck of a lot of cheatgrass as well. So if we were gonna go in there and do some seeding, we would really want to consider the animal's needs and the animal's performance requirements at that time of year, which can be a lot different than something on the right-hand side, which is looking at summer grazing. And so palatability of species gets to be a big issue. Also, especially on the dormant season grazing, how long is a plant going to be able to keep its protein levels up? And then they're going to drop, so when they drop down, what are our requirements going to be to get those supplements of the protein back up? On the right hand side, so the species that are, of course you see the larkspur, and then there's crested wheatgrass in that photo as well. So crested wheatgrass is one of those that when we start talking about pasture seeding, that from a standpoint of will it grow, it's one of the best ones out there. It's really easy to establish, drought tolerant, it's really competitive, but a lot of the times of the year the palatability is very low. So it becomes one of those trade, and it's also not a native, that becomes important for some people. If we're looking at early spring grazing needs, it might be one of the better choices. If we're looking at grazing needs in July, it might be not so great, especially if we're looking at putting weight on calves, or especially if we're looking at sheep, something like that. So those are, and then the other reason I put that larkspur in there is that, what are we going to be competing against, not just in terms of competing for growing, but what else is out there on the landscape that our animals are going to want to eat, or that, so in this case, a toxic plant. What could we introduce to help our animals not be going for those toxic species? So just a couple of quick examples up there about species selection. Instead of going like with crested wheatgrass in the summertime, could we think about something like a western or a thick spike wheatgrass that might extend our palatability longer into the summer, but might not get us quite the aggressiveness in establishment, or might not be quite ready so early in the spring? Might be something to consider. Okay, so species. So this field here, that's pretty hard to see, isn't it? Sorry about the light coming through the windows. This was one that was a real interesting project when we start talking about species selection. So this is a field day we had of a 40-acre field that was pretty much cheatgrass. It was 40 acres of cheatgrass. So how much feed supply did we have in there? Yeah, and not very much even in the spring. And so this was a project that we did where we really went to more like this in terms of seedbed preparation. It wasn't a no-till drill situation at all. Whoops. We went in there, did a lot of seedbed preparation, or a fair amount. We did some plowing and we did some disking in this field. And then I was going to ask you guys if you could identify some of the species in there, but it's really hard to see that photo. Can any of you tell though?
Looks like triticale.
Yeah, so there's triticale, oats, clover, and turnips in that field. And it was pretty dang awesome. And this is in Hot Springs County, just north of Thermop on the way to Cody, so like 5 miles out of Thermop. And we put turnips in the ground. And this is, so we do a little bit of like actual farming in Hot Springs County, but it's almost all down on the river, like you're going towards Worland instead of you're going towards Cody. And so there were quite a few people, like the neighbors and the locals, that were looking at that field like, what in the world are you growing? And so a lot of times anymore we start calling these sorts of plantings a cover crop, right? So I want you to think in terms of, some of those outside the box options that really work well. And I'm telling you what, the cattle that were on this was a picture of a field day that we had out there, but the cattle that got put on this kind of broke into it. They came through the fence and got onto it, and it was almost impossible to keep them off of this. This really made a nice field of feed. Not to mention that we went from basically nothing with the cheatgrass, 40 acres of cheatgrass to 40 acres of 3 to 4 tons per acre is what we had in here. It was really pretty cool. We had some questions that people were asking about choking on the turnips, cattle choking. And it was one of the most frequent questions that I got. And so I started looking around, kind of trying to do some research about it. And it's a very common question. But if you're going to use turnips, it doesn't seem like it's it's not something that happens frequently. So I'm not here today to sell you on the turnips necessarily, but I'm here to sell you on the perhaps there are opportunities that we can think outside the box a little bit. So for a range guy like me, the turnips was and for the producer that I know pretty well, like the turnips was definitely outside the box, but it worked really, really well.
Turnips are super for sheep.
Okay, yeah, yeah, I bet they
Is this
would be.
irrigated?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm gonna talk about, yeah.
That's what I
They're
want
only
to know.
annual, right?
Yeah, yeah. So everything in here except for the clover was an annual. Yeah. So you hit on the question that is gonna be my next one here, and that's this the irrigation is king, right? So if you have, I mean, the obvious thing is if you have irrigation, the possibilities just go way up, and your risk, your level of risk goes way down. That's just a simple fact of life, and it's going to increase our species selection too. So that's, again, one of the next questions I'm going to ask somebody when they start asking questions about seeding is I'm going to say, what is the availability of irrigation? If you have irrigation, your options go way up. So let me go to the other extreme, is if you have no irrigation and you're relying just on the rain and the snow, and you're in a typical dry Wyoming area, then your options for being able to pick and choose what you want go way down. And that's where you start really having to make compromises. And that's where your risk of failure go way up as well. So when someone starts asking me about dryland range seeding, I'm going to talk about your risk is going to be high. The risk of failure is high here. We are really dependent on getting those late winter snows and those very early spring rains. And so you have to start making compromises if you don't have the irrigation. And that's where you might have to start thinking about species like crested or pubescent that may not have exactly the palatability or the greenness into the summer that you prefer, but you're just restricted based on your resources. When we start have the ability to be able to irrigate, it's just like opening up the floodgates, no pun intended, right, on the species that we can use. And then up there in the window I have there this is starting to come up a lot on folks that are working with us on using the no-till drill, is this seeding window, okay? So I had folks there was a couple of folks on some very small plots that were using this no-till drill in early winter, this last winter, like December. They were in a sheer panic over getting the tractor and the drill in time because they were seeing this window, okay? So if we're talking about a dormant season seeding, for most of our species, what is this window that we have? So it's this time in the calendar that is the most advantageous to plant in, right? For most species, if we're talking about a dormant seeding, the window is huge, okay? So a dormant seeding in most of our country could be something from late October, early November, all the way through early spring, okay? There's a couple other windows I want to talk about. There's a very, very few species that actually need to be out on the range all winter long. They need what's called cold scarification. Forage kochia is one, Indian ricegrass might be another one, where they need to be out there all winter long to improve their success of seeding. So that might be one where we're really concerned about getting them out there in November, December, and letting them be out there all winter long. For most of our species, that is not the case. You want them in the ground, ready to grow, probably by very early spring. So when especially with my dryland range producers, most commonly with them, I'm telling them then, especially in Thermopolis, so the Bighorn Basin, a lot of Fremont County also would apply, but we tend to have a little bit earlier growing seasons than a lot of Wyoming. Is I tell people, like, you want stuff in the ground no later than the 1st of April, especially for a dryland range seeding. Or mostly for a dryland range seeding, because you want to take advantage. Now, if we're going to dormant seed that, it really doesn't matter unless we're using those very few species that need to be out there all winter long. It really doesn't matter that much from that seed's perspective whether they go out there in 1st of December or the end of March. It's still gonna work fairly well. Now, there are some situations where you can get some snow, some freeze-thaw events that will help get the seed into the ground. That's more of an issue if we're going to be broadcast seeding. So you're just spreading the seed on the ground, you're not drilling it into the ground. And on large acreages, in fact, I'm working on one right now in another part of the state where the seed's going to be flown on probably by a helicopter. So those situations, there might be some advantages to getting it earlier on in the ground because the snow and freezing and thawing will help drive it into the soil, improve your seed to soil contact. Yes, sir.
Do you do like a scarification or something before to help promote, like in a broadcast seed situation?
Yeah, so that can improve the seed to soil contact, and there's even some times where you could, on a situation where you could do some harrowing, broadcast the seed, and then re-harrow it again to improve it. The example I just gave was a burn, so the soil is pretty bare anyways already, and it's a larger landscape, so we don't quite have those options to do that. But on a smaller scale, absolutely.
So in a broadcast seeding, if you have a bunch of natural grass or even some weed and stuff, does the broadcast seeding seem to work as well as the drill, or?
No, so when you get away from a nicely prepared seed bed, irrigation, and drilling the seed in to the right depth, anytime you get away from that, your success rates go down. So when I start talking about the broadcast seeding, we're going to increase our seeding rates. We might double them. So if we're doing 5 to 6 pounds and we're going to drill it in, we might talking about be doing like 10 pounds of seed per acre if we're going to broadcast seed it. And then anything we can do, like to drag the field afterwards, if it's a smaller area and we have the animals to do it, to do some feeding on it, some anything like that, the hoof action to get on it is going to help as well.
So like coming in with a drag harrow or something?
Yeah,
afterwards?
yeah. Sorry, I was just looking at the time to make sure I don't go over for the next guy. But yeah, that's definitely something that can improve with the broadcast, helping that. But when you get away from those ideals that I talked about, your success starts to go down, so we have to do things to compensate for it. What other window is there that I haven't talked about?
Your seed depth for your grasses.
Okay, yeah, very important. I'm still on that window thing though, the upper one. So time of year, if you have irrigation and you're doing especially some grasses, I really like planting in the late summer, very early fall. But you pretty much need to have irrigation available to be able to do that. But that makes a really nice time to seed.
We run out of water a lot of times,
Yeah.
late summer, so you go plant something like that and turn the water off.
Right. It's a rare year in a lot of Wyoming. It kind of depends on where you are. Like in my county where I live in Hot Springs County. You know, in the western part, there's a lot of years where we're running out of water way before end of summer. But the guys on the river, they can irrigate, you know, they've got all kinds of water. So it kind of depends, because they're irrigating right out of the river, where those in western Hot Springs County are irrigating out of the creek. So if you have the resources to irrigate, which some of us do, don't neglect that seeding opportunity. The other thing is that you typically have less competition for manuals that time of year. It really makes a nice time of year to irrigate is that late summer. What you want to be careful of is this may be this, especially if you have irrigation, this may be the smallest window in terms of time, number of days that you have for a couple of reasons. In most of Wyoming, we're going to, especially that time of year, we're going to be planting cool season grasses, so they don't like it real hot. But they also don't need a bunch of frost days are not going to help them either. So if you're getting much past, I would not probably do this. Some years it might work, but I would not probably do that much past the first or maybe the second week in September. I'd really want to be shooting for that end of August, 1st of September timeline. And then you sort of move into that transition time between a late summer seeding and a dormant seeding. And so there's a stretch in there, and I was working with a ranch, one of our larger ranches in Hot Springs County, on some seeding this fall. And this fall was kind of crazy, right? It seems like the last couple of falls have been kind of crazy. We've had some cold and then hot and cold and hot. And so like, you really want to be careful. You get past mid-September, there's kind of a stretch in there from mid-September to probably mid-November where I'd be real careful about seeding almost anything. Like and by that I mean I would avoid it. Like, I'm either going to be shooting for that late summer seeding period, or I'm going to be waiting until I'm absolutely sure that this is a dormant seeding. Because you do not want to go too late in the year, have seed come up, and then get a hard freeze. And that'll just...
So now you're predicting the weather in November.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It turned off real nice in November. Everything was growing. I'm like,
I've got that down, right? Yeah, I can
Yeah.
predict the weather. Yeah. It's like the guys that are calving right now are geniuses, right?
yeah.
This year anyway, right? Yeah.
This year.
But no, I'm speaking. Thank you for pointing that out. But I'm speaking kind of in generalities, and it's going to be different. It's definitely different for Thermont than it would be for Pinedale, right? But you want to definitely be thinking in those terms of, maybe that late summer, early fall seeding technique wouldn't be so great in Big Piney. It works pretty dang good in a lot of the basin, and it would work very well in a lot of Fremont County and other places in Wyoming. But I wouldn't do it unless I had irrigation water available. We just almost never get the precipitation on the dry land for that to work very well. So site preparation, we kind of talked about that a little bit. Seeding depth. I think this is one of the biggest causes of failure especially in rangeland seeding. Other than the lack of moisture, this is a big one. And most of our grass seeds, think about if you've seen grass seeds, they are really small, okay? They need very good seed to soil contact, but you cannot plant them very deep without risking failure. We're talking 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch, and probably less than half is probably being that ideal situation where you want them. Now, if you're planting something like oats, oats will come up 1.5 inches, So it's with grasses, you have absolutely got to watch your seeding depth, and you do not want them to get very deep. I'd rather them too shallow than too deep, because you can probably get some better seed to soil contact on. If that was my choice, I'd probably rather increase my seed rate and broadcast it than plant it too deep.
I rented a no-till drill to plant some stuff from Stoats out here a couple years ago, and whoever had used it before, I was burying that seed 2-3 inches deep.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of time to reset the stupid thing, but I had to,
Yeah.
like you're saying, and then I was trying to plant 3 different kinds of species, and so it's tough.
Yeah, it is tough, especially if. So some of the drills have depth bands on them, so you can adjust how deep it's going. The one we have really just goes about 1/2 inch, and that's about it. And so, and you can, I've seen guys try to play with, depending on how it's mounted on the tractor, kind of play with the 3-point depth, but that you just cannot get it fine and find enough adjustments to really. You're probably hurting yourself more than you are helping.
In
yourself.
5 acres, you might get away with it.
Yeah. Which is really the size and steps that we're hoping to do on that little guy that we've got. So those are real important considerations looking at seeding establishment. Really consider where it's going, season of use, what it's going to be for, and then those seeding windows. So again, if you have irrigation available, you can, and depending on what the crop you're planting, like this cover crop that we planted, that didn't get planted till 1st of June. But we had all kinds of water, and it just really worked well. I would not be planting that without the water available.
It was water in Fremont County Board of House.
That's right.
Not on that place, it wasn't. That was melting off the Washington needles and coming down.
We always start that fight.
But I get your point. There's lots of water that comes from you guys. So those are the kind of the major, and we talked in a lot of generalities, and we'd be getting a lot more specific if I was working with you on an individual basis. Things to think about before we even get started. with our pasture seeding establishment. But the other important thing is to think about managing your stands after it's planted and come up, okay? So the post, you're successful. I work with a lot of folks that are new to owning land, new to grazing animals, and you've absolutely got to consider what you're gonna do with the stand afterwards and how you're gonna manage the grazing. So on a lot of new stands, or even a stand that may not be new, but it might have been burned and then it's coming up again. We want to think about, when is the first time we're going to start grazing? Okay, what are we going to let that new stand do before we start giving it pressure? So are we going to totally rest it for a whole year or 2 years? Or are we going to do something like a deferring grazing, until it sets seed? So especially with new seedings, we probably want to at least do a deferral on grazing. So let those seedings come up, set seed, do their thing, mature, and then we can get some grazing on them. And that becomes real important. And then the other side of that is, even as we move longer or farther away from the seeding itself, is how are we going to manage those stands? So, and this goes back actually to what's going to be grazing it and what time of year are we going to be grazing it. So if we're going to be doing some dormant season grazing, we have way more leeway in how we're going to be grazing it and the pressure we can apply to it than if it's something that we're going to need, say, in April and May. We need to be a lot more careful. And we might need to be, those might be at times where we look at maybe species that maybe wouldn't be the best for livestock performance, but they might be more resilient toward that spring grazing pressure. So I didn't want to spend too much time on this part of it, but it is definitely a consideration. We need to seriously think about sustainable grazing management after we get those stands in the ground. One of the resources I wanted to share with you guys is one of my favorite publications. I try not to say that too loud because one of my bosses is one of the authors on this, and he'd just get an even bigger head. But, this dryland pastures in Montana and Wyoming. I've only got the one copy. You're welcome to look through it, but I'm not going to give it to you. But you can print this off. It's available online for free. If you Google this, it'll be the first thing that comes up. It is a wonderful resource. So some of the things that I really like about this publication is it talks about some of the considerations that we've talked about today. But it also has these really cool charts that have species, and then they have all their characteristics down here, even seasons of use, whether they prefer acid or saline sites, soil texture, ease of establishment, whether they're native or introduced. We've got native cool season, introduced cool season, there's a warm season section, and there's a forbs and a shrub section as well. So this is a really handy publication to have. It also does talk about some grazing management. It's one that I use all the time and I refer people to all the time. So I highly encourage you guys to look up this publication and use it. Perry?
Do you ever, I may be really one off the edge here, do you ever take and you have pasture so bad, you want to get rid of it all and put herbicide on it first and then seed afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so given here, this is a pretty specific example for what you asked,
Yeah.
but that's one of my favorite uses of Roundup alfalfa, Roundup Ready alfalfa. And I know Roundup is an issue, and that's fine if it is an issue for somebody in this room, but that's if you've got the water and you can use the alfalfa and get through the expenses, that's one of my favorite ways to use Roundup Ready alfalfa. Because you can clean up, get alfalfa in there, get a crop going. For instance, there's a ranch that I'm working with, and we haven't done it yet, but they've got, it's kind of been a grass alfalfa hayfield that gets hayed, and then the aftermath gets grazed. That's kind of been the tradition. And like most of those kind of fields, it's gone, it's been a long time since it's been worked, so it's mostly grass now. And then they have this spot that's probably 2 or 3 acres, and it's low, that's being really taken over by foxtail barley, which is, if you don't know what that is, I hate it. It's a horrible grass. Livestock don't like to graze it. It's aggressive, especially in this environment. And so it's not a super low spot, but it's just kind of low enough that foxtail barley really likes it. And so they wanted to go in there and just like what you're talking about, did this one section of the field and just totally fallow it. And they were gonna, and chemically they were gonna do it. And so we started talking about things, and I'm like, well, let's go in there with Roundup Ready alfalfa. And that way we're not gonna lose the production, and we can still kill the foxtail barley that's there and still maintain some production. We haven't, and that's been used in a lot of places. The example I'm talking about is, that's our plan for this spring to go in there and do it. But yeah, that kind of technique works. Burning, plowing, so burning, doing mechanical things like going in and plowing and disking, chemically, yes. The answer to your question is yes, and I kind of went off on a tangent there for you.
That's fine.
Yeah.
You have any luck dry land and like late alfalfa in this country?
I do see, where I've seen it probably the most successfully used are in pastures that sort of more domesticated pastures that might get every once in a while a shot of irrigation, but not very often. I haven't seen it, not that it hasn't, but I haven't seen it work real well in just a strictly range environment. It absolutely could somewhere. I don't have a lot of experience with it in that way. I have experience with it in domestic pastures that every once in a while receive some water, might have slightly better soils. I've seen it work pretty well in those situations. And I like it in those situations too. Any other questions? Well, I hope it's been worthwhile for you guys to come. You guys can find me. I'm on our webpage. I'm in Thermop. Any of the crew in Fremont County could always get a hold of me, or you could probably look me up pretty easily. I'd be happy to answer any questions. If you could, there's a few evaluation sheets here. These help us out. Fill these out. There's not very many, but a few you could. So thank you for coming. I'll be around for a few minutes if anybody has any other questions. Appreciate it. What's that? Absolutely, yeah.
So,